Hey guys, tonight we step inside the broken jaws of one of the most recognizable ruins in the world, the Colosseum in Rome. The moonlight seems to spill across the jagged walls like liquid silver, and your footsteps echo against stones that once heard the roars of lions and the cheers of tens of thousands of spectators. You can almost hear it, the thunder of sandaled feet, the metallic clang of armor, and the faint smell of sweat and roasted meat drifting from forgotten stalls. You're here now in the belly of this massive shell, staring up at what used to be an arena so colossal that emperors strutted proudly just to show they had enough money and slaves to pull it off. Half of it still looms over you, massive and imposing, but the other half, gone, ripped away, stolen, shattered, toppled, and whittled down by centuries of indifference and greed. And here's the kicker, you probably wouldn't survive 5 minutes if the whole thing were intact and you had to fight in it. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, let me know where you're watching from and what time it is over there. I love seeing the map of sleepy listeners fill up across the globe. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You start by dragging your fingertips along the cool travertine. It feels pitted uneven, a skin aged by centuries of weather and neglect. Half the wall curves smoothly, proud and upright, while the other half falls away into ragged edges like a cake someone sliced and forgot to frost. The missing half isn't some mystery portal into another dimension. It's the sum of earthquakes, human scavengers, and the unstoppable truth that even the grandest buildings get old, cranky, and leaky. You imagine Roman masons sweating as they stacked block upon block, never guessing their handiwork would one day look like a dentist's nightmare grin, half teeth, half gaps. The Colosseum was finished around 80 CE, the kind of grand I'm the emperor, look at me project that Flavian emperors loved. Up to 50,000 people packed in here, clutching figs and bread, ready to watch whatever bloody circus was on the schedule. But stone doesn't stay pristine forever. By the 5th century, Rome was already shrinking, resources drying up. Maintenance, forget it. The arena became a ghost of itself, cracks widening, dust gathering, and pigeons nesting. Imagine being the unlucky janitor assigned to sweep this place when nobody cared anymore. Then came the real gut punches, earthquakes. Not once but several times across centuries, the ground beneath Rome shifted violently. Stones groaned, arches buckled, and whole swathes of the Colosseum caved in like a souffle collapsing. You'd think Rome, sitting smug on its 7 hills, would be earthquake-proof, but nope. One quake in 847 shook the southern side so hard that huge chunks toppled outward, leaving the jagged gap you can still trace today. Another quake in 1349 brought even more of the southern flank down. The northern arc, sturdier thanks to stronger ground, stood firm, which is why the Colosseum looks lopsided today, half proud soldier, half crumbled skeleton. And yet, wandering among the broken blocks, you sense it wasn't just nature's tantrums that left this ruin half-eat. People played their part, Romans with chisels and carts, eager to turn ready-cut blocks into free construction supplies. Imagine the scene, a nobleman pointing at the wall saying, "That's a fine arch, let's have it in my villa pronto." Stone thieves chipped away piece by piece, dragging off marble, iron clamps, and bricks. Every missing bit was a story of human need or greed. Historians still argue whether people looted more because of desperation in lean centuries or out of sheer opportunism, but the result was the same, a Colosseum bleeding into Rome itself. By now you're standing on the arena floor, staring up through what's left. Above you the sky yawns wide, framed by half-arches like broken ribs. It's quiet save for the whisper of wind weaving through gaps where once stood crowds. That missing half doesn't feel like absence anymore, it feels like a map of everything that's happened since. Quakes, looters, popes, tourists. The Colosseum has been cracked, carved, and cannibalized, yet it still looms. You can almost hear it sigh. Half of me is gone, but the half that remains remembers everything. Shuffle along the crumbling rim where shadows pool deep in broken arches. Your breath catches at the thought that once upon a time, every tier around you would have been packed solid with people, citizens fanning themselves with scraps of cloth, merchants selling honey cakes, senators adjusting their togas so they looked more important than they felt. But now the silence is cut only by the breeze and the empty seats gape like missing teeth. You pause, run your hand across a scar in the stone, and realize the Colosseum didn't just politely age, it got pummeled repeatedly by the earth itself. Rome has never been free from earthquakes, though you'd think the ancients would have picked a steadier foundation for their megastructure. One quake in 442 CE weakened the bones of the amphitheater. Then in 847 CE, a particularly brutal shake tore open its southern flank. Stones as large as oxen crashed down, dust cloaking the city. You imagine the chaos, locals rushing to the site, half horrified, half thinking, well, free bricks. It must have looked like the building itself had finally collapsed under the weight of all the gladiators and elephants it once held. But the knockout punch came in 1349. A monstrous quake rippled through Rome and the Colosseum groaned like an old door hinge before whole tiers gave way. The southern side, built on softer alluvial soil, sheared off while the northern side clung stubbornly to its firmer volcanic rock. That's why when you look at it today, it's lopsided, like a boxer who got clocked hard on one side but kept standing. Historians still argue whether medieval chroniclers exaggerated the damage for drama, but if you walk here now, the missing half speaks for itself. The debris scattered across Rome like confetti, streets clogged with rubble, stones rolled downhill into neighborhoods. Some chunks were dragged away almost immediately, recycling at its most opportunistic. You picture oxen hitched to wagons, groaning under the weight of colossal blocks once polished smooth for emperors. The quake had done half the work for them, snapping and splitting where chisels would have struggled. For a moment, you try to imagine being in the arena that day as the ground began to tremble. The creak of beams, the cascade of dust from overhead arches, the scream of falling masonry. Survival instinct would have kicked in, but escape? Not easy when surrounded by walls designed to keep people inside. You'd be jostled in a human stampede, tripping over sandals, praying to Jupiter that you'd make it through one of the vomitoria, the exits, charmingly named for how fast they spewed out crowds. You probably wouldn't survive that either, let's be honest. Earthquakes weren't just natural disasters, they were cultural reset buttons. Each one reshaped how Romans saw the Colosseum. No longer the flawless monument of imperial might, it became fragile, mortal, a reminder that even emperors couldn't command the earth. Some saw it as divine punishment. Others shrugged and thought, well, cheaper than hearing a quarry. As the dust settled after 1349, the Colosseum looked less like a stadium and more like a ruin in progress. Houses crept into its arches, grass sprouted in cracks, and yet the remaining half stood tall like a stubborn survivor refusing to bow out. You tilt your head back, watching the stars peek through the jagged opening where stone once blocked the sky. It feels like the ruin is winking at you. Earthquakes may have split me, but I'm not done yet. You wander deeper into the shadowy arches, the air cooler here, damp against your skin. Your footsteps crunch over grit and chips of stone, tiny leftovers of centuries of plunder. The missing half of the Colosseum isn't just the story of earthquakes, it's also a tale of theft on an industrial scale. Rome's own citizens, popes, and noble families treated the amphitheater not as a sacred monument, but as the city's biggest and most convenient home depot. After the 1349 quake, piles of freshly fallen travertine, marble, and brick lay sprawled across the southern side like a collapsed wedding cake. To medieval Romans, this wasn't tragedy, it was opportunity. Imagine you're a stonecutter in 1400. Why trek to Tivoli's quarries miles away when giant pre-carved blocks lie ready to be pried loose and carted off? You hitch your mule, grab your chisels, and before the dust even settles, you're hauling a chunk of ancient Rome into someone's new doorway. Marble, once gleaming white, vanished fastest. It was easy to carve, expensive to quarry fresh, and looked fabulous as cladding for palaces and churches. You can almost see it, masons prying decorative marble panels off the Colosseum's walls, sweat glistening on their backs, stacking slabs onto wagons bound for piazzas. Walk around Rome today and you'll find bits of the missing half everywhere. The marble of St. Peter's Basilica, some of it used to be Colosseum dressing. Fountains, stairways, even chunks of the Vatican's own structures carry its ghost. Historians still argue whether the popes encouraged this recycling because they needed material fast or because they saw the amphitheater as a pagan relic better dismantled than preserved. And it wasn't just marble. The iron clamps that once held blocks together were pried out too. To get at them, looters cracked stones apart, leaving telltale gouges you can still trace with your fingers. Rome's skyline grew taller and shinier while the Colosseum slouched lower, emptier, more skeletal. The nobility weren't shy about this pilfering. The Barberini family, one of Rome's powerhouses, gained a reputation for helping themselves so liberally to the Colosseum's bones that locals coined the biting phrase. What the barbarians did not do, the Barberini did. That's right. The family was blamed for finishing the work of invading hordes by carting off Rome's own heritage. You imagine one of those grand Roman palaces, its marble staircase gleaming as servants bow and guests gossip. Few of them pause to consider that the stair once belonged to gladiators' walls, echoing with the roar of the crowd. To them, stone was stone. The Colosseum was merely an abandoned quarry with good branding. Even popes played both sides. One day they were stripping stone for new basilicas, the next declaring the site holy because Christians had supposedly been martyred there. You stand in the shadow of a half-gone wall and shake your head. Mixed signals much? As you trace the empty sockets where marble once gleamed, you realize the Colosseum's missing half isn't gone. It's simply scattered, hidden in plainer sight than most ruins. Every time you admire a Renaissance piazza or a Baroque church, you're looking at a borrowed chunk of amphitheater. The Colosseum lives on across the city, but in fragments like a body whose organs were donated elsewhere. The arches sigh around you as if embarrassed by their own disrobing. Half a monument still stands, but the other half has been dressed up in other people's clothes, parading through Rome in disguises you'll never fully spot unless you look closely. You duck under a half-fallen arch, the stone chilled like a cave wall, and suddenly the ruin doesn't feel like a ruin anymore. It feels lived in echoes of footsteps that aren't just tourists or scavengers but residents. Because for a strange stretch of its life, the Colosseum wasn't just an abandoned shell waiting to be plundered, it was somebody's home. Not just one somebody, but entire families. By the early Middle Ages, when Rome had shrunk into a patchwork of villages inside its old walls, the Colosseum transformed from imperial playground into fortress. You picture warlords peering out from its arches like eyes in a skull, banners fluttering between crumbling pillars, guards perched with crossbows where once the crowd cheered gladiators. The amphitheater was too strategically placed and too solid to ignore. Why build new walls when the Flavians had already given you a ready-made citadel? The powerful Frangipani family moved in around the 12th century, claiming the arena as their stronghold. Imagine dinner inside an arch, torches throwing shadows across ancient graffiti, stew bubbling while armored men clanked by. The Colosseum's skeleton provided defense but also prestige. Owning it meant you were somebody in medieval Rome, a time when crumbling imperial relics were fair game for ambitious families. Historians still argue whether the Frangipani really fortified the entire structure or only sections, but the legend of the Colosseum as castle stuck. Life in a fortress Colosseum would have been uncomfortable. Drafts slipped through gaps where marble once sealed the walls, rain pooled in corridors, and yet families carved out homes, storing grain in the vaults, herding goats through the corridors, even stringing laundry where emperors once strolled. The Colosseum had been designed to contain beasts and blood sport. It adapted easily enough to medieval domestic chaos. When rival families clashed, the Colosseum's bulk became a prize worth fighting for. You can almost hear the clash of swords echoing through its passages, replacing the roars of lions with shouts of mercenaries. Smoke curling from cooking fires must have blackened stone that once gleamed under mosaics. Over time, though, fortress life frayed. Families shifted, fortunes crumbled, and by the 14th century, earthquakes and looting left the arena less a castle and more a shabby neighborhood. Picture narrow huts leaning against massive arches, wooden doors nailed into gaps, chickens scratching in the dust where emperors once sat. Travelers in the Renaissance wrote about poor folk living in the ruins like squatters in a forgotten palace. You can almost imagine the awkward introductions. Welcome to my humble home. It's the third arch on the left, right under the collapsed tier. The Fortress Colosseum was both survival and irony. Rome's great monument, built to awe and dominate, was reduced to shelter for goats, paupers, and ambitious nobles alike. Its missing half wasn't just stones carted away, it was dignity eroded by being repurposed into something utterly ordinary, part castle, part apartment block. You tilt your head back at the towering curve that still stands and wonder what it would be like to fall asleep here, wrapped in blankets, listening to wind howl through arches as wide as city gates. In a way, those medieval families did exactly that, making the broken amphitheater their cradle in a world that had forgot what it once meant. You step across uneven ground littered with stubs of columns and broken stone, and the Colosseum shifts in your imagination again. No longer a fortress or a noble family's prize, it becomes something even more practical, Rome's biggest quarry. Forget pickaxes in distant hills. Why carve stone from mountains when you've got an ancient mega arena ready to be stripped bare right here in the city center? After the fortress era waned, Romans of every stripe treated the Colosseum like an all-you-can-take buffet of building material. Renaissance and Baroque architects in particular swooped in with cartloads of ambition, eyeing its sturdy travertine blocks like jewelers eyeing uncut diamonds. Want to build a fancy fountain? Pop by the Colosseum. Need columns for your palazzo courtyard? The amphitheaters got plenty. And the beauty of it was, much of the southern side had already collapsed thanks to those earthquakes. You didn't even need to tear it down, just load up the rubble and go. Picture teams of oxen dragging wagons piled with blocks the size of refrigerators. The squeal of iron wheels, the clop of hooves, the grunts of men heaving marble onto carts. All around, the Colosseum stood like a patient giant being carved down piece by piece, one rib taken for a church, one vertebra for a palace, one tooth for a fountain. Historians still argue whether the pillaging was officially sanctioned or simply tolerated, but one thing's clear. The Colosseum was the raw material behind much of the Rome you stroll through today. Take Piazza Venezia, for instance. The steps leading into elegant churches, likely born from Colosseum stone. The ornate fountains you toss coins into, same story. Even the new St. Peter's Basilica, the pride of Catholic Rome, gleams with marble stripped from this old pagan showground. The missing half didn't vanish, it was reincarnated. Rome's rebirth as a Renaissance jewel came quite literally at the amphitheater's expense. And it wasn't just stone. Bricks were carted away in thousands, reused to patch up everything from bakeries to basilicas. Decorative cornices were repurposed as trim for noble homes. Imagine strolling through a posh Renaissance courtyard, wine glass in hand, not realizing that the elegant lintel above your head once framed a gladiator's entrance. There's something almost comic in it, really. The Colosseum was once designed to showcase Rome's power and permanence. Then centuries later it became the very material for Rome's makeover, feeding its stones into piazzas and palaces as if it were a giant recycling bin. If monuments had feelings, the Colosseum must have sighed with every wagon load leaving. There goes my shoulder, and now my hip, oh wonderful, they've taken my front teeth too. And yet the quarrying stopped just short of total annihilation. Popes occasionally stepped in to remind people this was also a Christian site of martyrdom, though historians still argue how many martyrs actually died here, if any. That sacred association, combined with the sheer bulk of the remaining walls, meant the Colosseum was never fully dismantled. Rome used it, but Rome couldn't quite erase it. Now when you walk through the city and admire its fountains, basilicas, and palaces, you're unknowingly walking through fragments of the missing half. The Colosseum didn't disappear, it dispersed, dissolving into the veins of Rome itself. Half a ruin remains here, half a city gleams elsewhere, and together they tell the same story. Permanence is an illusion, but recycling, that's eternal. You drift along the cracked corridors, and the echoes of your steps begin to overlap with the whispers of power, papal voices, edicts written in Latin, the clash between preservation and plunder. The missing half of the Colosseum isn't just earthquakes or opportunistic quarrying. It's also the product of centuries of papal schemes, contradictions so tangled you'd think Rome was playing chess against itself. On some days, popes treated the amphitheater as a convenient stone yard. Picture masons sweating under papal commissions, hauling off blocks to raise grand basilicas. The Basilica of San Pietro in Vincali, the Colosseum fed it. Palazzo Venezia, same story. Whenever the papacy wanted to flex architectural muscle, the amphitheater offered ready-made muscle fibers. The missing half scattered like seeds under the orders of men who preached about eternity while stripping the bones of history. But on other days, the same popes turned solemn, declaring the Colosseum sacred. By the 18th century, papal bulls claimed Christians had been martyred here, their blood soaking the arena floor. Historians still argue whether that's historically accurate or simply propaganda. After all, executions certainly happened, but not all scholars agree it was the primary site of Christian suffering. Yet the legend stuck, and suddenly this battered ruin was draped in holiness. Picture Pope Benedict XIV in 1749 striding across the rubble with determination. He consecrated the Colosseum as sacred ground, forbidding further use as a quarry. Crosses were erected, stations of the cross laid out. What had once been Rome's loudest theater of blood was rebranded as a hushed cathedral of martyrdom. You can almost hear the sigh of relief in its walls. Finally, someone said, hands off. And yet, even then, the schemes didn't stop. Some popes wanted to rebuild parts of it, others wanted to transform it into practical structures like wool workshops or hospitals. The Colosseum was always under negotiation, holy ruin one decade, construction supply yard the next. Rome seemed unable to decide whether to protect it, reuse it, or let it crumble. From your vantage on the broken southern rim, you imagine the scene, papal architects sketching plans by candlelight. Nobles lobbying for permission to carve away one more arch, while local families simply continued grazing goats in the corridors, ignoring the holy decrees overhead. It was messy, inconsistent, a patchwork of ambition and reverence. The irony is delicious. The Colosseum, once the empire's iron fist, became a bargaining chip for men in robes, half devout, half pragmatic. Its missing half is as much about papal politics as stone theft. Rome's leaders tried to save it while simultaneously dismantling it, like a parent who lectures about protecting a cake while stealing frosting with their finger. And so the amphitheater endured, half hollow, half whole, caught between sacredness and scavenging. You step back, look up at the yawning arches, and realize the Colosseum's missing half isn't just absence, it's the visible proof of centuries of indecision, contradictions etched into stone. You pause beneath a broken archway, and for a moment you forget earthquakes, popes, and quarried stones, because what really takes over your senses here is nature itself. The missing half of the Colosseum is more than human theft and tremors, it's also the creeping, stubborn takeover by plants, animals, and weather. Time has teeth, and it bites in quieter ways than falling stone. Imagine springtime in medieval Rome. The cracks in the Colosseum's fallen half sprout with grasses, tiny wildflowers pushing up through dust. Seeds carried by wind, dropped by birds, or stuck to the fur of goats rooting around the rubble found a perfect new home. With no gardeners to prune them away, plants flourished. Over the centuries, the Colosseum turned into an accidental botanical garden. Travelers in the 1600s wrote about vines dangling like curtains, moss slicking the stones, and shrubs bursting out of arches like green fireworks. By the 19th century, botanists actually cataloged the flora here. Over 400 species of plants had claimed the ruins, and not just common daisies and ivy. Because Rome was a crossroads for travelers, seeds from across the empire and later the globe took root. There were plants from North Africa, Asia, even the Americas. The Colosseum became an ecological scrapbook of Rome's global connections. Historians still argue whether some of those exotic plants arrived on traders' clothes or through imported soil, but either way, it gave the ruin a wild, untamed charm. Picture yourself lying back on a fallen block, watching swallows wheel above as vines crawl over the jagged stone beside you. The amphitheater once staged lions and tigers for spectacle. Now its arches frame foxes, pigeons, lizards, and bees. Nature doesn't need ticket sales, it just sneaks in quietly and refuses to leave. There's humor in it too. The same Romans who once engineered elaborate underground elevators for gladiators couldn't stop a stubborn weed from cracking marble apart. The missing half of the Colosseum was weakened as roots pried stone loose, moisture seeped in, and storms widened every crevice. You can almost hear the plants chuckling. Nice empire you had here, shame if something grew on it. And yet the greenery gave the ruin new life. Painters of the Romantic era adored sketching ivy-draped arches, lovers picnicked among the wildflowers, and poets sighed about the cycle of nature conquering man. The missing half became not just loss but transformation, half a ruin, half a garden, breathing again in a softer, greener way. You step carefully over a cluster of weeds sprouting in a crack and smile. The Colosseum's wild side is still here, still stubborn, still reminding you that history is never finished. What humans broke, nature softened, wrapping the ruin in vines like a blanket over an old, weary giant. You lean against a half-fallen column, and suddenly the ruin feels less like a battered wreck and more like a stage set. Because by the 18th century, the Colosseum wasn't just a quarry or a fortress. It had become art. Its missing half, jagged and lopsided, was no longer a problem but a muse, and Rome's poets, painters, and dreamers lined up to swoon over it. The Grand Tour was all the rage then, a kind of luxury study-abroad trip for wealthy Europeans. If you were a young nobleman from London or Paris, you weren't cultured until you seen Rome. And when you saw the Colosseum, half gone and half standing, it wasn't disappointing, it was perfect. Broken arches framed the sky like windows designed for melancholy. Shadows slanted across exposed corridors. Ivy wrapped itself romantically around crumbling stones. The ruin became a living postcard of beauty and decay. Poets wrote of moonlit nights wandering through the arches, candle in hand, whispering lines about time and mortality. Painters lugged easels into the dust, trying to capture that blend of grandeur and collapse. You picture a gentleman in a powdered wig sighing dramatically. Ah, how noble Rome looks in ruin. Historians still argue whether the romantic obsession with ruins helped save the Colosseum from further destruction, but the tide of perception clearly shifted. What had been a quarry became a monument again, valued not for utility but for atmosphere. The missing half became the most picturesque part. Its jagged edges made the perfect silhouette for sunsets, its hollowed-out chambers ideal for sketching shadows. Tourists whispered about gladiators and martyrs, embellishing stories until fact and myth tangled like vines in the walls. Some even chipped off tiny souvenirs, pocketing pieces of stone as keepsakes of their brush with history. And then there were the lovers. By lantern light, couples strolled hand in hand across the arena floor, the ruin's emptiness becoming a backdrop for private dramas. To them, the missing half symbolized fleeting beauty, the fragility of human endeavors. You can almost hear them muttering soft declarations while pretending not to notice the rats rustling in the weeds. For Rome itself, this romantic gaze was both flattering and useful. A city strapped for cash could now lean on its ruins as attractions. Instead of selling the Colosseum piece by piece, it could market the ruin as an experience, half broken, half eternal. The amphitheater's missing half turned into an asset, a feature rather than a flaw. Standing in the cool night air, you realize how strange this transformation is. A stadium once echoing with screams of beasts became a muse for candlelit poetry. Half destruction, half preservation, it was reinvented through the lens of imagination. The Colosseum was no longer just stone, it was mood, and the missing half was its most eloquent line of poetry. You ease down a slope of rubble, lantern light flickering across jagged walls. The voices of poets and painters fade, replaced by the scrape of shovels and the mutter of men in dusty coats. By the 19th century, the Colosseum's missing half wasn't just something to sigh at, it was something to dig into. Archaeologists, scholars, and treasure hunters swarmed the ruin, eager to peel back layers of history and figure out exactly what had gone missing. Picture the scene, workers lowering themselves into dark passages beneath the arena, hauling out soil bucket by bucket. Candles sputter, ropes creak, and suddenly the labyrinth of hypogeum, the underground tunnels where gladiators and beasts once waited, comes into view. The missing half above their heads gave them better access but also left mysteries. Did the fallen stones once cover secret chambers? Were there collapsed sections hiding forgotten relics? Historians still argue whether much of what was taken disappeared into private collections or was simply hauled away unrecorded, vanishing into the anonymity of Rome's building projects. There was a frenzy for relics. Excavators hoped to find weapons, armor, maybe even bones. Some discoveries thrilled them: graffiti carved by bored workers, coins dropped by spectators, fragments of frescoes still clinging to damp walls. But much of what the missing half once sheltered was simply gone, lost to looters centuries before. You can almost feel their frustration, like kids arriving at a candy store only to find the jars already licked clean. The debates raged. Was the Colosseum once completely ringed with statuary? Were there hidden vaults under the collapsed south side? Did parts of the missing structure hold treasures beyond stone? Scholars squabbled over theories, some insisting that vital details were destroyed in the earthquakes, others blaming centuries of pilfering. Even now, archaeologists shake their heads at the gaps, knowing they may never map the amphitheater in its original perfection. Yet the digging revealed something else. The ruin itself had layers like a cake baked over centuries. Medieval walls built into ancient ones, plant roots knotted through marble, Christian shrines tucked into corners. The missing half wasn't just empty, it was full of overlapping stories, evidence of all the people who had squatted, prayed, or scavenged here. You crouch near a dark pit, imagining yourself lowering into the hypogeum. The air grows colder, wetter, smelling of earth and iron. You trace grooves where pulleys once lifted cages, hear phantom chains rattle. It's eerie, almost claustrophobic, and you realize the missing half gave scholars their best chance to rediscover these spaces. In losing stone, the Colosseum gave up its secrets. Of course, not all excavators were patient scholars. Some were treasure hunters with itchy fingers, carting artifacts off to private cabinets of curiosity. The Colosseum bled knowledge as much as it revealed it. The debates continue: how much is forever lost because people valued shiny souvenirs over careful study? Still, every shovel of dirt deepened the fascination. The Colosseum's missing half wasn't simply a wound, it was an open door into history, though one that never gave a full answer. You straighten dust on your hands and glance upward at the broken rim. The ruin seems to grin back at you, half mocking, half generous. Take what you can, but you'll never know the whole story. Step into the remaining half of the Colosseum, the sunlight pouring through arches like golden rain, and take a deep breath. Here, standing on the arena floor, you feel the immense weight of survival. The missing half isn't just absence, it's a testament to what this monument endured, what it survived, and what it still whispers to anyone patient enough to listen. Time has battered it relentlessly. Earthquakes cracked, toppled, and shredded parts of its southern side. Humans scavenged what was left, feeding palaces, fountains, and basilicas with fragments of imperial grandeur. Families turned it into a fortress. Nature claimed it with ivy, grasses, and wildflowers. Popes argued over its use and preservation. Poets romanticized its decay, and archaeologists painstakingly unearthed what fragments remained. Historians still argue whether it could ever have been fully restored, but the truth lies in the half that stands, solid, lopsided, defiant. As you trace your fingers along its worn travertine, you can see evidence of all these layers. Gouges from looters, chisels, moss creeping through cracks, medieval brickwork, faint etchings from tourists centuries ago, all overlap in a patchwork story. The missing half may have been ripped away, crumbled, or repurposed, but the part that endures tells the story of survival. You imagine the gladiators' footsteps, the roar of the crowd, the metallic clang of weapons. Then the earthquake shaking everything into ruin, the carts of marble hauled away, the Pope's proclamations and scholars' disputes. Each layer adds texture to the story, giving the ruin depth far beyond its stone. You realize the Colosseum's missing half is more than just what's absent. It's the invisible presence that shapes how you experience the remaining half today. And yet, despite all its trials, the Colosseum stands. You picture future visitors, tourists, dreamers, children walking where emperors once did, pausing in awe at the sheer scale, unaware of how much of it is gone, but feeling its power all the same. The ruin's half-life tells you something crucial. Destruction doesn't always mean erasure. Sometimes survival means transforming, dispersing, and inspiring, even in pieces. As the sun dips lower, the arches cast long, angular shadows across the arena floor. You sit on a stone, feeling the breeze and the faint echo of centuries of life. The Colosseum doesn't need its missing half to command attention. The story of what's gone fuels the imagination even more than what remains. Standing there, you understand that history isn't just recorded. It's felt, lived, and carried forward by the very gaps that time has left behind. You trudge alongside the dusty formations, each step kicking up clouds that settle into your throat. In the distance, you hear the clanging of armor, the muttered counts of centurions, and the occasional groan of a tired mule dragging supplies. Food is on everyone's mind, not just as a source of energy but as the heartbeat of life in the Legion. The daily rations, known as annona, are meticulously calculated, roughly 2.5 pounds of grain per soldier, supplemented with a splash of oil, a pinch of salt, and occasionally a hunk of hard cheese. Historians still argue whether these rations were sufficient for the punishing marches, but most agree they kept the troops alive enough to fight. Quirky little fact: legionaries sometimes carried portable mortars, tiny stone bowls for grinding grain in the field, because a soldier who can't crush his own porridge is not a soldier for long. You stand over a simmering pot, watching the grain bubble in its oily broth, and realize that your hands smell faintly of iron and earth, a smell that lingers for hours. The porridge, surprisingly, is often sweetened with honey or occasionally a handful of dried fruit, if the supply wagons were generous that day. Imagine crunching a piece of hardtack, dry enough to sand your gums, while your comrade mumbles about the delights of yesterday's salted fish. Every bite is functional, every morsel a calculation of energy versus convenience. And yet, despite the monotony, soldiers joked over meals, swapping tips about how to soften stale bread or hide a precious honey cube from the mess sergeant. That cheeky camaraderie is perhaps the only seasoning more potent than garum, the fermented fish sauce that sneaks into almost every legionary stew. By the end of a full day of marching, digging fortifications, and standing guard, the grain-based meals feel like a lifeline. You feel the subtle tingle of salt on your lips, the lingering chew of coarse porridge, and the steady drum of your heart, fueled by the simplest, most consistent of rations. And as night falls, the campfires flicker against the darkness, casting long shadows over scattered pots and half-eaten meals. You realize that survival isn't just about the sword. It's about the sustenance in your satchel, the weight of a loaf of bread, and the faint, stubborn hope of a fresh hunk of cheese tomorrow. You trudge past the row of tents, the earthy scent of trampled soil mixing with the tangy aroma of boiling grains. Grains and pulses form the backbone of every legionary's sustenance, the reliable, almost boring staples that keep you marching under the blistering sun and biting wind. Wheat, barley, and lentils dominate your bowl, simmered into a thick porridge called pools, sometimes stiffened into dense, hard cakes for longer campaigns. Historians still argue whether these grains alone could truly sustain a soldier during extended battles, but everyone agrees that without them, the legions would collapse like a poorly built fort. You scoop a mouthful of gritty barley porridge, the warm grains sticking to your teeth and gums, and you almost forget the sweat trickling down your back from the relentless march. Fringe fact: some soldiers spice their gruel with ground-up dried dormice because apparently a pinch of rodent protein is better than none, though you probably won't try that at home. Lentils, surprisingly versatile, were a prized pulse, boiled or mashed with oil and salt, sometimes sweetened with honey if the supply wagons allowed a rare indulgence. You notice that the porridge is often divided into 3 daily servings, a rigid schedule that demands patience even when your stomach growls louder than the evening drum signals. Imagine kneeling beside a simmering pot on a cold morning, stirring thick grains with a wooden spoon while your companion sneezes from the dust of a nearby cart. You realize that consistency is everything. The grains, often stored in coarse linen sacks, can survive weeks of travel without spoiling, making them the perfect soldier's friend. And yet some days the monotony gnaws at your morale. One soldier quietly adds a pinch of ash from the campfire to his meal, convinced it improves digestion, a weird trick that other soldiers copy out of curiosity, not science. Despite their plainness, these meals are layered with survival strategy. Each lentil, each hardened bread chunk carries more than calories. It carries tradition, routine, and the subtle promise that tomorrow, your feet will march another mile, your arms will wield the gladius, and you will still be alive to taste that grainy porridge again. You glance around the camp, noticing soldiers quietly comparing the softness of their gruel, laughing softly at the cracks of hardened bread softened over fire. Even in the tedium of starch and legume, a sense of camaraderie percolates, the shared struggle making each bite slightly sweeter. Even if the flavor isn't, you trudge onward, the dust settling into your hair and clothes, and the thought of meat pricks your senses like a distant, tantalizing dream. Meat in the legionary diet is a rarity, a luxury that most soldiers only glimpse in moments of celebration or plunder. Usually, protein comes from salted pork, dried beef, or the occasional salted fish, carefully rationed to survive long campaigns. Historians still argue whether legionaries ever consumed fresh meat regularly, or if preservation techniques dictated a diet more reliant on pulses and grains than flesh. You tear into a slab of hard, briny pork, the smell pungent enough to make your stomach twist with anticipation. Fringe fact: some soldiers reportedly carried smoked dormice or small birds for emergencies, sneaky snacks tucked into leather pouches, though such items were frowned upon in the official rationing lists. Occasionally, local markets along the march would provide fresh meat, but it was always a gamble, an unpredictable joy that could vanish by the next sunrise. You chew thoughtfully, the salt clinging to your tongue, reminding you that flavor often meant survival rather than pleasure. Imagine standing beside a campfire while a comrade brandishes a small, shriveled fish, claiming it's the best protein source since the last supply wagon. You notice how the meat is often boiled or roasted slowly over embers, sometimes crumbled into the thick porridge to stretch it further. Smoked meats become a prized commodity, traded among soldiers for extra oil or a scrap of cheese. And yet, even these routines contain room for ingenuity. Some inventive soldiers would mash meat into a paste, mixing it with grain to make it last longer, a strategy that, oddly enough, tastes better than you'd expect. The scarcity of protein makes every bite meaningful, embedding a sense of ritual into the consumption of even the smallest pieces. You notice how hands shake slightly with anticipation when a new ration appears, and how soldiers compare the salt content of their slabs with subtle nods, a silent ranking system of taste and luck. Every chew feels heavy with history and necessity, a reminder that the Roman legion's endurance isn't built solely on courage or steel, but on the careful management of meager, sometimes peculiar protein sources. By the time night falls, your stomach is oddly satisfied not because of abundance, but because of the intimate knowledge of how every morsel matters and how survival often tastes saltier than any feast. You trudge past the flickering shadows of campfires, the earthy aroma of burning wood mingling with the faint sweetness of stewed vegetables. Vegetables and fruits, though less central than grains or meat, offer variety and crucial vitamins to sustain the legionaries through long, grueling campaigns. Carrots, onions, cabbage, and seasonal greens are boiled, roasted, or sometimes eaten raw, depending on what the local market or foraging allows. Historians still argue whether the Romans fully appreciated the nutritional value of these foods or if they were simply filler to stretch more precious rations. You nibble a small, bruised apple, the tart sweetness almost shocking against the backdrop of bland porridge and salted pork. Fringe fact: legionaries occasionally dipped their fruits in fermented wine or honey to disguise bruising or to celebrate minor victories. It's a small joy, a fleeting reminder that food can be pleasurable even in the drudgery of military life. Depending on the season and region, other fruits such as figs, grapes, and pomegranates make appearances, often shared as barter with local civilians. These small luxuries, though inconsistent, bring a fleeting warmth and morale boost to the soldiers' daily routines. Imagine kneeling over a steaming pot of cabbage soup while a comrade carefully slices onions with a blunt knife, tears streaming from the smoke, yet everyone smiles through the sting. You notice that some soldiers cultivate minor superstitions. A sprig of parsley on a cabbage pot is said to ward off bad luck in battle, while a lone cherry is saved for the bravest among them, a gesture that combines both playfulness and ritual. These seemingly trivial habits embed a cultural rhythm into daily consumption, turning even mundane meals into moments of connection. The vegetables, though humble, are essential, especially when long campaigns make meat scarce. They are often boiled into thick stews, their flavors mingling with grain and oil, creating an improvised symphony of sustenance. Fruits offer rare sweetness, a momentary distraction from the constant ache in tired legs. You crunch thoughtfully on a carrot, its earthy tang grounding you in the present, a reminder that survival is as much about small comforts as strategic victories. And when night falls and the camp settles into the quiet hum of distant guards, the memory of a shared cabbage pot or a stolen fig lingers like a whisper of home, softening the harsh edges of the legion's relentless march. You trudge past the low murmur of soldiers cleaning their bowls and tending smoldering fires, and your senses catch the tangy, sometimes sharp scent of cheese and fermented sauces wafting through the camp. Cheese and other dairy products are vital additions to the legionary diet, adding calories, protein, and a welcome flavor boost to otherwise monotonous rations. Hard cheeses travel well over long marches, while fresh milk is rarer and often reserved for officers or special occasions. Historians still argue whether cheese was a daily necessity or more of a supplemental luxury, but evidence shows it was certainly valued enough to be consistently supplied. You bite into a chunk of salty, semi-hard cheese, the grainy texture offsetting the bland porridge you've been chewing all morning. Fringe fact: some soldiers reportedly soaked cheese in vinegar or wine to soften it and add flavor, a practice that might seem odd but actually made the dairy more palatable and less likely to spoil. Fermented fish sauces, particularly garum, are liberally added to stews, porridge, and even vegetables. The pungent, fishy aroma can make newcomers gag, yet veterans swear it elevates every meal into a proper feast. You realize that this combination of cheese and garum forms the backbone of the legion, improvised seasoning, proving that necessity really is the mother of culinary invention. Imagine a comrade carefully grating a hunk of aged cheese over a steaming bowl of lentils while whispering conspiratorially about how the garum can mask even the most suspicious-looking meat. You notice the subtle hierarchy of flavors: olive oil from the Mediterranean, honey if supplies permit, a pinch of salt, all layered into a stew that is surprisingly complex despite its utilitarian origins. And yet, soldiers develop odd preferences. Some insist on dipping their bread into milk first, claiming it improves digestion, while others hide tiny amounts of garum in secret corners of their satchels for later indulgence. By the end of the day, these flavor enhancers do more than improve taste. They reinforce routine morale and the subtle joys of shared knowledge. You crunch thoughtfully on a piece of stale bread softened with cheese, the tangy richness lingering on your tongue, and realize that survival depends on creativity as much as rationing. The interplay of dairy, fermented sauces, and the stubborn resilience of soldiers creates a rhythm to camp life, a culinary heartbeat that keeps you grounded and oddly comforted. Even in the monotony of marches and monotonous grain, a splash of cheese or a drizzle of garum can transform the mundane into a quiet triumph of taste, however fleeting it might be. You trudge alongside the flickering shadows of makeshift kitchens, the smell of burning kindling mingling with the smoky tang of simmering rations. Cooking in the field is both an art and a necessity, and legionaries become surprisingly resourceful given the constraints of portability, rationing, and unpredictable terrain. Portable utensils, bronze or iron pots, simple pans, and occasionally small mortars for grinding grain, are standard issue, while fires are carefully managed to conserve both fuel and flavor. Historians still argue whether legionaries relied more on structured cooking techniques or improvised methods adapted from local populations. You stir a bubbling pot of grain and vegetable mash over a small fire, the heat pressing against your hands and face as sparks drift upward. Fringe fact: some soldiers carried portable tripod grills to roast meat directly over embers, often adjusting the height with sticks they found along the march, a method that blurred the lines between cooking and engineering. Fire management is a skill, balancing the need to cook food thoroughly against the risk of revealing your position to nearby enemies. Smoldering embers, coals carefully stacked, and even damp soil used to control flame height all demonstrate the legionaries' mastery of survival gastronomy. Imagine huddling beside a campfire on a rainy morning, the wood hissing as water drips into flames, and watching comrades carefully stir rations into something resembling an edible consistency. You notice rituals forming even around cooking. Some soldiers always stir clockwise to encourage good fortune, while others chant faintly as they drop vegetables into boiling water. Even mundane actions are given significance, creating a subtle rhythm to daily life that extends beyond the march. Cooking is both functional and communal, the act of preparation a moment of temporary respite, a tactile connection to normalcy in a world defined by mud, armor, and constant motion. Field cooking also demands creativity. Grain porridge may be enriched with crushed nuts or dried fruit scavenged from local markets, while meat is softened in wine or water for hours over low heat. When fresh vegetables are scarce, soldiers sometimes resort to wild herbs or roots, relying on memory or local guidance to avoid inedible or poisonous plants. You realize that survival in the field is as much about knowing which wild foods can supplement rations as it is about wielding a sword. By the time night falls, the scent of smoky porridge, garum, and roasting meat lingers, wrapping the camp in a shared olfactory signature that signals both sustenance and safety. You trudge through the buzzing activity of the camp, where the faint clink of amphorae and the sweet smell of spiced wine mingle with the heavier aromas of stews and roasting meats. Occasionally, the supply lines bring rare luxuries: imported olive oil, small amounts of wine, dried fruits from distant lands, or even spiced sauces that remind soldiers of home. These items are coveted, sometimes hoarded, and always cause subtle skirmishes of sharing and barter. Historians still argue whether such luxuries were widespread enough to impact the average legionary's morale or merely occasional treats for those with luck or rank on their side. You sip a thin, surprisingly tart wine, your tongue catching the subtle bitterness of herbs mixed in during fermentation. Fringe fact: some legionaries reportedly flavored their wine with seawater or pine resin, a curious method that both preserved the drink and added a flavor profile that would be almost unrecognizable to modern palates. These rare indulgences serve as more than sustenance. They're morale boosters, moments of joy, or even subtle status symbols, a token of wealth or favor when shared within the group. The aroma alone is enough to remind soldiers that life can be more than hard marches and grain porridge. Imagine passing a supply wagon as it opens to reveal sacks of dried figs and nuts, and the instantaneous ripple of excitement as soldiers quietly claim their shares. Some ration carefully, hiding small treats for later, while others share freely, sparking quiet camaraderie or whispered envy. You notice that the presence of luxury items fosters subtle hierarchies within the camp. the officer or veteran who secures the best wine or olive oil, quietly reinforcing authority and social bonds. And yet, even the most disciplined soldier can't resist sneaking a tiny morsel of spiced meat into their porridge, the flavor making the monotony of routine almost bearable. Trade and foraging also play crucial roles. When legions are stationed near civilian settlements, soldiers trade surplus grain for local delicacies, cheeses, fruits, and occasionally rare herbs or spices. You see a comrade swapping a small bag of hardtack for a wedge of creamy cheese, the transaction silent and efficient but full of significance. These moments illustrate how the legions were not just instruments of war, but participants in a dynamic culinary network that stretched across the empire. By nightfall, the smell of roasting herbs, bubbling wine, and simmering stews fills the camp, reminding you that even the smallest luxury in a soldier's ration carries the weight of both survival and indulgence, however fleeting. You trudge past the edge of the camp, where the smell of smoke is thinner and the ground is scarred from repeated digging and marching, and you begin to notice the subtle signs of hunger and scarcity. Hunger is a constant companion for the legionary, especially during extended campaigns or in hostile territory where supply wagons arrive late, or not at all. Shortages force soldiers to improvise, stretching rations, foraging for wild plants, or even repurposing otherwise inedible scraps. Historians still argue whether these extreme measures were common or the exception, but accounts suggest that ingenuity was essential for survival. You nibble on a handful of roasted acorns, the bitter crunch a strange but serviceable filler for your growling stomach. Fringe fact: some legionaries reportedly boiled moss or tree bark into a watery paste to supplement meals, a desperate practice that nonetheless speaks to their determination to endure. Water scarcity compounds the problem. You sip sparingly from a canteen, knowing that every drop counts, and sometimes mixing wine or vinegar to make brackish water more palatable and slightly safer to drink. Even mundane habits like carefully counting portions or sneaking extra grains into pockets are vital survival strategies, small rituals that make the difference between a soldier thriving or faltering on the march. Imagine watching a comrade carefully dismantle a bundle of wild herbs, separating leaves from stems, trying to coax flavor and nutrients into a thin broth. You notice that some soldiers develop peculiar tricks, crushing certain roots to disguise the taste or roasting small insects for a rare protein boost. These strategies, while unusual, underscore the legionaries' adaptability, and they often become unofficial tips passed quietly from veteran to novice. Hunger transforms cooking and eating into a complex blend of necessity, creativity, and psychology, where the mental battle is as important as the physical one. Despite scarcity, communal meals reinforce bonds, sharing even the smallest portions, laughing quietly over inventive hacks, and whispering about who found the sweetest wild berries creates a subtle social structure. You crunch on a piece of dried bread softened in water, savoring every texture and nuance, and realize that survival is as much about ingenuity, camaraderie, and morale as it is about the calories themselves. The camp, though ragged and weary, hums with quiet resilience, the collective effort to endure giving each soldier a fleeting sense of triumph amid scarcity and fatigue. You trudge past the flickering fires where soldiers gather, the aroma of simmering stews mingling with the metallic tang of armor and sweat, and you notice that meals are more than fuel, they're rituals, cultural touchstones, and tiny pockets of solace in a brutal life. Communal eating is central to the legionary experience. Soldiers sit in rough semicircles, sharing portions, exchanging jokes, and observing subtle rites that bind them together. Historians still argue whether these traditions were formalized or developed spontaneously, but evidence shows that food and ritual were inseparable in daily legion life. You tear a piece of bread and dip it into a communal pot of garum-seasoned porridge, the tangy flavor mingling with the bland starch, and you notice the ritualistic patterns forming around every meal. Fringe fact: some soldiers would toss a few grains into the fire or murmur a quick blessing before eating, a superstition believed to protect them from harm or ensure favor in battle. Religious offerings were sometimes made with portions of wine, bread, or small sacrifices of meat, performed quietly before the main meal. The gestures are subtle but carry weight, intertwining nourishment with spiritual and psychological comfort. Imagine a soldier quietly breaking a chunk of bread, offering half to a comrade, while another sprinkles a pinch of salt on the fire in homage to a minor deity. You observe the micro-hierarchy in these rituals. The centurion often eats last, distributing portions, while veterans subtly enforce etiquette, ensuring fairness and maintaining morale. Quirks abound: some soldiers always chew a certain number of times before swallowing, convinced it prevents indigestion or bad luck. Others keep small charms or lucky herbs tucked near their mess, blending superstition seamlessly with routine. The rituals and culture around food reinforce identity and cohesion. Shared stories, jokes, and superstitions help soldiers endure monotony, fatigue, and the constant specter of danger. You crunch thoughtfully on a boiled carrot, the sweetness faint but comforting, and realize that every action, dividing rations, seasoning a porridge, whispering a prayer, is a thread in the web of community. Food becomes more than survival, it becomes memory, morale, and an anchor to humanity amid the harsh demands of legionary life. Even in the smallest bites, you taste centuries of tradition, endurance, and a strangely comforting sense that, no matter how harsh the day, you are part of something larger, sustained by both grain and shared ritual. You trudge past the remnants of spent fires, the aroma of cooling stews fatting into the evening air, and you notice how the echoes of legionary cuisine ripple forward through history. The foods they carried, prepared, and shared have left subtle imprints on modern palates, influencing recipes, preservation techniques, and even military rations today. Historians still argue whether these culinary traces are direct lines of inheritance or merely coincidental reinventions, but the similarities are too striking to ignore. You nibble on a piece of rustic bread, imagining the legionary who might have done the same over 2,000 years ago. Fringe fact: some modern Italian cheeses and fermented fish sauces are believed to descend directly from Roman-era recipes, though with ingredients tweaked for contemporary tastes. Olive oil, wine, garum, and porridge-style grains persist in subtle ways in Mediterranean cuisine, giving us a tangible connection to the soldiers who once trudged across Europe and North Africa with nothing more than a satchel of grains and a hunk of hard cheese. Imagine sharing a simple stew with friends today, unaware that the flavor profile, a mix of grains, legumes, a touch of salt, and a hint of fermented sauce, is a culinary echo of ancient survival. You notice how modern techniques mimic legionary improvisation, slow-cooked meals, dried provisions, and layered flavors that stretch scarce ingredients. Even our concept of the military ration carries lessons learned from Rome: durability, caloric efficiency, and the occasional small indulgence to maintain morale. The legionaries' attention to both nutrition and resourcefulness is a blueprint that persists subtly in kitchens and camps around the world. By evening, the camp settles into quiet, and you feel a faint satisfaction from tracing these legacies through centuries. Each bite of bread, each sip of wine or olive oil carries not just flavor but history, the endurance of humans adapting, sharing, and celebrating small pleasures amid hardship. You realize that the story of legionary food is ultimately a story of resilience, creativity, and community. And as you set down the remnants of your simple meal, the knowledge that these culinary echoes continue to influence what we eat today wraps the day in a warm, reflective glow. The Saxon Mead Hall isn't just a building, it's a sensory arena, a place where survival, politics, and revelry intertwine. Above your head, the beams are darkened from centuries of smoke, yet sturdy enough to bear the weight of hanging herbs, weapons, and even carved masks meant to intimidate intruders, or perhaps entertain them. You notice the central hearth, a roaring pit of fire, not just heating the hall but offering a kind of spiritual heart to the community. Flames crackle, sparks drift upward, and the smell of roasted venison makes your stomach grumble. Oddly, some Saxons believed that the smoke itself could chase away spirits or bad luck, a superstition that seems charmingly quaint now, though historians still argue whether these fires were purely practical or held deeper symbolic meaning. You take a step further in, the straw crunching beneath you, and you feel the vibration of boots, the shuffle of furs, and the occasional clang of a belt or sword. Horns of mead pass from hand to hand, and you catch snippets of conversation, challenges, boasts, and long-winded recitations of battles you probably won't understand. But then, a fragment of music reaches you, a plucked string accompanied by a low chant, and suddenly the chaos becomes rhythm, a pulse that threads everyone together, if only temporarily. Somewhere near the back, a small figure, probably a scrawny youth, juggles a handful of roasted nuts while reciting lines from an epic you've never heard. You blink and wonder whether he's performing acrobatics for entertainment or because failing would invite an angry push into the straw. In the margins of your attention, a few women move efficiently through the crowd, handing out plates, topping cups, and occasionally hushing unruly children, their faces serene yet commanding. Their presence reminds you that the hall's survival depends on more than brute strength. Coordination, cunning, and ritual all play a role. The benches are carved roughly, each one telling its own story in chipped edges and burn marks, perhaps souvenirs from long nights of celebration or long nights of chaos. You notice a horn displayed on a wall, not just for drinking but probably used in war or hunting, a reminder that even in feasting, the Saxons never fully escaped their violent world. And yet, there's a comforting predictability in the disorder. Everyone knows their role, from the lord on his high seat to the youngest page scuttling across the floor. You trudge past a table where meat is carved by a burly man with a knife that looks far too large for comfort. The aroma is divine, the meat tender, and you almost reach out, until a warrior bumps into you, spilling a bit of ale on your sleeve. You laugh because what else can you do, and the hall swallows your moment of discomfort in its roar. You realize that survival here isn't about brute strength alone, it's about knowing when to bow, when to speak, and when to raise your cup. Historians still argue whether the hall's social chaos encouraged unity or merely masked simmering rivalries, but tonight, that argument feels secondary to the warmth, the noise, and the fleeting sense of belonging. Everywhere you look, objects tell stories. A shield propped against a beam, a carved boar's head above the doorway, horns etched with names and victories. And then, in a corner almost hidden by shadows, you glimpse a small heap of coins, probably offerings or fines for past misdemeanors, glittering faintly in the firelight. Fringe accounts claim some Saxons buried tiny charms under benches for luck in battle or love, superstitions that seem almost absurd now but would have been deadly serious to someone in this hall. The air is thick, your senses on overload, and yet a part of you leans into it, fascinated by the dance of smoke, light, and humanity. You realize this is what the Saxon mead hall is really about, a microcosm of their world, full of ritual, hierarchy, superstition, and celebration, all pressed into a space where survival, memory, and merriment collide. You probably won't survive long here if you're not careful, but for a few hours you can live as they lived, moving with the rhythm of the hall and feeling its pulse in your chest. You trudge deeper into the hall and your eyes are immediately drawn to the central hearth, a massive pit of roaring fire that casts dancing shadows across every timber and bench. The heat washes over you, carrying the scent of burning wood, meat, and the faint tang of spilled ale. You probably won't survive standing too close without singeing a sleeve, but somehow the Saxons navigate this inferno with practiced ease. The hearth is more than just a source of warmth. It is the heart of the hall, the anchor for conversation, feasting, and ritual. In its glow, warriors sharpen swords, scops recite tales, and children huddle in furs, wide-eyed at the flickering flames. Oddly, some believed that the smoke itself could repel evil spirits, that curling tendrils could sweep away misfortune before it reached their homes. Historians still argue whether the fires were purely practical or deeply symbolic, but tonight you can feel both the heat and the significance. You notice women moving gracefully along the edges of the hall, replenishing mead, adding wood to the fire, and fussing over the cooking spits. They carry wooden ladles that gleam in the firelight, scooping soups and stews from cauldrons that bubble and hiss. Fringe accounts claim that certain herbs were tucked into the flames to promote invisibility or ward off curses, a quirk that makes you glance over your shoulder as if something unseen is creeping toward you. Some herbs smoke so heavily that they almost make you cough, yet you can't help but admire the ritual precision with which these women work. Historians still argue how much real influence they held over gatherings that appear male-dominated on the surface. But in moments like this, you see that the survival of the hall depends on their skill. The benches around the hearth are filled with Saxons leaning forward, elbows resting on rough-hewn tables, faces flushed from ale and excitement. You watch as a warrior tosses a chunk of roasted meat to another across the fire, almost like a primitive form of team sport. The smell is intoxicating, a blend of honey, smoke, and simmering vegetables, and it presses on your senses so insistently that you find yourself imagining the taste before you even touch it. In a quieter corner, someone has hung a small charm of carved bone and string over the fire. Fringe historians suggest these were placed there to influence dreams or ward off enemies, a belief that seems absurd yet somehow feels fitting amid the chaos. You trudge closer, letting the heat prick your skin, and notice that the hearth's construction is impressive. Stones blackened from centuries of flame, a fire pit wide enough to roast several animals at once, and a flue designed to carry smoke upward without suffocating the hall. The smoke curls toward the rafters, mingling with the smell of wood, meat, and spilled ale, giving the air a texture you can almost taste. Some say the hearth's arrangement was modeled on the sun, a kind of symbolic center connecting the earthly hall to cosmic forces above. Historians still debate whether such symbolism was intentional or simply poetic interpretation by later observers. A young boy kneels at the hearth's edge, poking embers with a stick, sending a small plume of sparks upward. You notice that the sparks briefly illuminate carvings on the surrounding beams depicting long-forgotten battles, hunts, and heroic deeds. Fringe tales claim some beams were haunted by the spirits of ancestors, whispering guidance or warnings, though you're pretty sure it's just a draft in your imagination. Regardless, the effect is mesmerizing. You trudge past the hearth to peek into the cauldron at its center. Thick stews simmer with meat, root vegetables, and fragrant herbs, the sort of dish meant to sustain a hall full of hungry warriors through long winters. The women ladling soup pause to nod at acquaintances, their movements smooth and practiced, almost ritualistic. You probably won't survive the sheer energy required to keep the hall fed, warmed, and safe during feasts, yet here they move with an efficiency that makes the entire hall possible. Their voices rise over the din, calling out names, warning of spilled ale, and coordinating the rotation of dishes from fire to table. Even in the heat, you notice a strange calm about them, a controlled pulse beneath the chaos of firelight and laughter. Somewhere near the far wall, a small bundle of herbs burns quietly, sending a sweet, smoky scent into the air. Saxons believed this could mask the aroma of the hall from malevolent spirits, or perhaps from rival warriors plotting to intrude during the feast. Historians still argue whether such rituals were widespread or limited to fringe communities, but you can feel the layers of belief interwoven with practicality. The hearth is not just fire, it is magic, community, and survival all rolled into one, a living center around which everything else revolves. As you trudge back toward the benches, you notice the shadows of people moving against the flames, their laughter and shouts mingling with the crackle of burning wood. Someone leans in to pass a plate, and you catch the aroma of honeyed meat, spiced with herbs you can't identify, a taste almost within reach. The hearth pulses like a heartbeat through the hall, and you realize that every face you see, every object, every flame is connected through this central axis. The Saxon mead hall survives because of this fire, because of the people tending it, and because of the belief, rational, symbolic, or superstitious, that warmth and smoke keep the community alive. You probably won't survive long in this space unprepared, but standing here watching the smoke curl toward the rafters, you feel a pulse of life that the centuries cannot extinguish. You trudge toward a long table piled with bowls of mead, honey glinting in the firelight, and you realize that this hall's heartbeat isn't just fire, it's fermented honey, the golden elixir that lubricates conversation, negotiation, and occasional chaos. You probably won't survive the first few rounds if you attempt to drink like a Saxon warrior, but that doesn't stop you from watching, fascinated, as hands reach for horn cups, lifting them high in synchronized toasts. Mead is the lifeblood of the hall, produced from honey, water, and wild yeast in a process that's deceptively simple yet endlessly debated by historians, some of whom still argue whether Saxons preferred their mead thick and sweet or watery and sharp. The truth, you suspect, lies somewhere in between, leaving plenty of room for speculation and fringe tales. Nearby, a man swirls his cup, letting the liquid catch the firelight, and claims to have brewed it using honey collected from bees kept inside hollowed tree trunks. Fringe sources suggest that certain brewers infused mead with herbs meant to enhance courage, wit, or even dreams, an intoxicating mix of practical fermentation and superstition. You watch as another warrior tips his cup over his shoulder, a gesture of luck before taking a bite of roasted boar, and you can't help but smile at how such rituals echo through centuries. Historians still debate whether these drinking customs were purely ceremonial or had tangible social consequences, like determining rank or settling disputes. The hall vibrates with song. As Scops strum lyres and recite epic tales of past heroes, their voices climbing and falling in hypnotic cadences. You probably won't survive the endless stories if you try to follow every name and event, but the rhythm and spectacle keep everyone enraptured. Between the verses, you hear the occasional laugh or cheer when a line hits close to home, or when a boast is so preposterous it's impossible to ignore. Some fringe accounts suggest that Scops sometimes performed while balancing on shields, an acrobatic feat meant to demonstrate skill and courage simultaneously, though you suspect it's more legend than fact. Historians still argue how accurately oral storytelling preserved history versus glorifying myth. You take a tentative sip of mead from a horn passed to you, tasting honey and fire in a single warming mouthful. Around you the hall grows louder, fueled by the liquid courage coursing through veins. Men lean close to whisper strategy, rivals challenge each other to drinking duels, and laughter bounces off timber and rafters. You notice the careful choreography in the chaos. Cups never collide, plates rotate efficiently, and songs pause only briefly for dramatic effect. The entire space seems alive, responding to the ebb and flow of alcohol, stories, and ritual. A small group at the end of the table engages in a curious practice, dipping mead-soaked bread into their cups and letting it sit for a moment before eating. Fringe historians speculate this was done to please spirits, encourage fertility, or simply enhance flavor. You watch the pattern, mesmerized by the collective participation and silent agreement on the ritual's importance. Meanwhile, someone passes a horn to the hall lord, whose hand rests lightly on the cup, the flickering fire illuminating a carved seat that marks his authority. The hierarchy in the hall is subtle but unmistakable. Those closest to the hearth and mead enjoy the first choice of both alcohol and attention. Historians still debate whether the influence of these positions extended beyond ceremonial respect or truly dictated policy. The walls themselves seem to hum with memory, adorned with shields, helmets, and carved animals. You notice a peculiar decoration, a horned figure etched into a beam, supposedly meant to ensure courage for those drinking beneath it. Fringe tales suggest that those who ignored the figure's warning might suffer poor fortune in battle, a superstition that blends seamlessly with practical caution. You probably won't survive scoffing at these beliefs if you want to blend in, so you nod politely at the beams and let the legends weave through your imagination. By now, the rhythm of the hall is intoxicating. The fire crackles, the songs swell, and the mead flows freely. You watch a group of younger warriors trying to outdrink one another, their laughter echoing like bells through the timber. Some spill mead over the benches, others toast in rapid succession, and the Scops incorporate every mishap into their ongoing saga, immortalizing even minor clumsiness in song. Historians still argue whether these indulgences promoted camaraderie or encouraged recklessness, but in this moment the question is moot. The hall pulses with life, celebration, and chaos in perfect, intoxicating harmony. You trudge through the crowd, noticing that even the smallest gestures carry significance. A nod, a raised cup, a song echoed just so. These are the unspoken rules of the hall, guiding behavior as reliably as any law. Fringe accounts suggest that. You trudge toward the elevated platform at the far end of the hall, your boots clacking against the rough-hewn floor as you glance up at the high seat where the Lord presides. The position is more than just a chair. It's a throne of authority, carved from oak, reinforced with iron, and elevated just enough to remind everyone of hierarchy without alienating them completely. You probably won't survive trying to take it uninvited, yet there's an undeniable thrill in observing the subtle power plays around it. From here, the Lord can survey the hall, raise a hand to silence squabbles, or tip a horn in acknowledgement of a particularly clever jest. Fringe accounts claim that some lords had their seats designed with hidden compartments for valuables or even poison vials, but you'll have to take that with a grain of salt. Historians still argue whether seating truly dictated influence or merely reflected it. The benches leading to the high seat are arranged meticulously, and you notice the invisible choreography of the hall. Allies sit together, warriors of similar rank shoulder to shoulder, while newcomers or uncertain guests are gently nudged to the periphery. Oddly, some Saxons engaged in what modern sources call boar-feast diplomacy, using shared meals, horn toasting, or the ceremonial passing of roasted boar to negotiate status or allegiance. You probably won't survive the subtle politics without observation, yet it's fascinating to watch the interplay of respect, rivalry, and ritual unfold like a living tapestry. As you trudge closer, the Lord rises slightly to receive a cup of mead from an attendant, the gesture signaling recognition and favor. Around you, the hall acknowledges the exchange with nods, murmurs, and sometimes laughter. The hierarchy is woven into every action: who speaks first, who eats from which plate, whose cup is filled when, and even whose story is told next. Fringe accounts suggest that missteps, like taking a seat meant for someone of higher rank or drinking out of turn, could provoke minor duels or public mockery. Historians still debate how rigidly these rules were enforced, especially when alcohol blurred judgment. The carvings on the high seat are intricate: spirals, runes, and images of past warriors staring down challengers long gone. You probably won't survive examining them too closely without becoming entranced by the implied stories, yet you can trace the intent. The chair isn't just furniture. It is a statement, a memory, and a warning. Some carvings reportedly contain secret symbolism, referencing victories or curses, a fringe idea that makes you glance around as if ancestors might be watching. The Lord gestures for silence, and the hall gradually quiets, though the murmurs never fully disappear. Someone recounts a tale of a recent raid, embellishing it with heroic feats, exaggerated injuries, and dramatic animal encounters. The high seat commands attention not just because of elevation, but because of the weight of authority, the expectation that all eyes and ears will follow. You trudge along the edges of the hall, noting how warriors shift slightly to offer unspoken deference, how younger Scops pause mid-verse, and how even the women serving food maintain a subtle but respectful distance. A peculiar ritual unfolds near the high seat. A guest of honor is offered the first bite of a roasted boar, presented ceremoniously with a flourish of hands. Fringe accounts claim that some lords used these moments to test the bravery or loyalty of newcomers, observing their reactions for hidden meanings. Historians still argue whether these feasts were genuine trials or largely performative displays of status. You probably won't survive trying to game the ritual, but observing it is like watching diplomacy, psychology, and theater collide in one fluid motion. The room hums with tension and camaraderie simultaneously. You notice that the positioning of weapons along walls, the placement of benches, and even the angle of torches is intentional, creating sightlines and visual dominance for the Lord's platform. Fringe reports suggest some lords secretly adjusted their high seats to manipulate acoustics, ensuring their voice carried over the din without straining. You probably won't survive attempting such architectural espionage, but you can appreciate the cleverness. You trudge past a cluster of warriors whispering in low tones, glancing occasionally toward the high seat. Some share news, others gossip, and a few boast of feats they hope will earn recognition. The lord's nod or frown is enough to validate or challenge each statement, a subtle yet powerful control mechanism. Historians still debate how much real political power a high seat conferred versus its ceremonial importance, but tonight, it is impossible to ignore its gravitational pull. Finally, you pause near the foot of the platform, observing the layers of interaction. The ritualistic passing of mead, the distribution of food, the subtle signals of respect and rank. You probably won't survive violating any of these layers, but watching them unfold gives you a visceral understanding of Saxon society. The high seat isn't just wood and iron, it's authority embodied, a nexus of hierarchy, ritual, and subtle power games. Every glance, gesture, and toast reinforces the order of the hall, reminding you that survival, influence, and honor are inseparable in this smoky, lively microcosm of Saxon life. You trudge along the benches now, letting your eyes settle on the Scops performing near the hearth, their voices carrying above the hubbub of clinking horns and shouted boasts. The hall's storytellers aren't merely entertainers, they are the memory keepers, the conveyors of glory, shame, and cautionary tales. You probably won't survive attempting their feats of memory and oration without years of practice, yet watching them is mesmerizing. One young Scop plucks a lyre while weaving a tale of a long-dead king, inserting his own embellishments and audience prompts with flair. Fringe accounts suggest that some Scops performed while balancing atop shields or even doing backflips across the benches, though you suspect much of that is myth. Historians still debate the reliability of oral history versus the evidence unearthed from archaeological digs, but tonight, you can feel the pulse of stories that bind the community together. As you trudge closer, you notice the audience, warriors, women, and children alike, leaning forward, wrapped in the narrative. Some nod in approval, others clap hands or stomp feet to emphasize dramatic points. The Scops' words shape perception, highlight virtues, and even pass subtle warnings. Who is brave, who is cunning, who has fallen short in loyalty. Fringe tales suggest Scops occasionally inserted riddles or veiled insults, daring listeners to respond correctly or risk embarrassment. Historians still argue whether these performances were strictly educational, entertainment, or a form of social control. You probably won't survive if you try to memorize the intricacies of these sagas in one night, but it's worth noticing how the Scops weave fact and fiction seamlessly. One story recounts a battle where warriors fought a giant serpent, a clear exaggeration, but the kernel of truth underlines bravery, resourcefulness, and the consequences of recklessness. Another tale blends divine intervention with strategic genius, reminding listeners that luck, skill, and favor from the unseen often intertwine. The Scops' presence is physically demanding too. They must project voices over a rowdy hall, strum lyres while keeping rhythm, and punctuate their verses with dramatic gestures. Fringe accounts claim that some performed while holding burning torches or spinning atop barrels, risking singed hair or broken bones to heighten spectacle. You probably won't survive such acrobatics, but the energy is contagious, pulling even the most distracted warriors into the narrative. You trudge closer to a small cluster of young apprentices, watching them imitate their elders in hushed tones, practicing diction, timing, and memorization. In some cases, they repeat stories verbatim. In others, they are encouraged to improvise, adding local gossip or inside jokes. Historians still debate how much freedom the apprentices had versus strict adherence to tradition, yet the practice ensured continuity of communal memory across generations. In a corner, you notice a subtle interplay between Scops and warriors. While the storytellers are respected, they are not immune to critique. Some audience members call out corrections, others shout challenges, and a few attempt to outwit the tale with jokes or personal anecdotes. Fringe accounts suggest this interaction was a form of social calibration, the hall collectively deciding which deeds are worthy of admiration, which are trivial, and which are best forgot. Historians still argue whether oral storytelling created a relatively democratic record of history or reinforced elite narratives. You trudge past a table where women quietly listen, occasionally nodding, sometimes murmuring advice to a Scop about pronunciation or emphasis. Their input is subtle but influential. The stories must resonate with the whole hall, not just the warriors. Fringe sources even claim that women occasionally corrected factual errors in tales, though you probably won't survive calling out a Scop mid-performance without awkward consequences. The rhythm of the hall shifts as one of the older Scops begins a tale of ancestry, describing the lineages of those seated in the hall, their victories, and their debts. You probably won't survive tracking every relation and name, but it's fascinating to observe how the stories reinforce hierarchy, honor, and social obligations. Fringe accounts even suggest that some Scops memorized genealogies to manipulate social outcomes subtly, though historians still debate how widespread or effective this practice truly was. By the time you trudge back toward the hearth, the hall is humming with energy, the scop's stories entwining with the laughter, music, and clanging of horns. You probably won't survive attempting to perform these tales yourself tonight, but witnessing their power is enough. The stories connect generations, remind the living of the dead, and keep alive a cultural identity that stretches far beyond the smoke-filled walls. The scops, like the hearth and the mead, are the invisible glue of the hall, ensuring that memory, myth, and mirth continue to burn as fiercely as the fire at its center.